The first drop barely mattered. It landed on a patch of dry earth, vanished into the dust, and left almost no trace behind. A second followed, then another. Within minutes, the wind changed direction, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of wet stone and soaked leaves. The sky darkened, birds disappeared into the trees, and the forest became strangely quiet. If you lived 40,000 years ago, this wasn't the beginning of a peaceful afternoon. It was the beginning of a test. Long before cities, farms, or even written language, people couldn't simply wait for bad weather to pass. They couldn't watch the rain through a window or wrap themselves in a warm blanket. Every storm changed the landscape around them, and every decision they made over the next few hours could determine whether their family would still be alive by sunrise. Rain wasn't just weather, it changed the rules of survival. Life has quietly erased just how powerful rain really is. We hear it tapping against our roof and think of comfort. We make tea, read a book, or fall asleep to its gentle rhythm. But for thousands of generations, that same sound carried a completely different meaning. It meant uncertainty, it meant hunger, and sometimes it meant death. At first, the biggest problem wasn't getting wet, it was losing time. Every hunting group understood something simple but unforgiving. Food didn't wait. Herds kept moving. Birds migrated. Fish followed changing rivers. If your group missed the right moment because of several days of relentless rain, you couldn't just visit another valley tomorrow. By then, the animals could already be dozens of miles away. Nature never paused, simply because humans wanted it to. Imagine spending days carefully watching a herd of wild horses. You memorize where they drink. You notice which trails they follow before sunrise. You prepare your stone spear, sharpen your cutting tools, and quietly plan the safest place for an ambush. Then, the storm arrives. By morning, every footprint has disappeared beneath thick mud. Familiar trails become streams. Fallen branches block narrow paths. Even the smell of animals becomes harder to follow as rain washes scent away. Days of observation vanish overnight. To ancient hunters, that wasn't frustrating, it was devastating. Yet hunting wasn't always the greatest danger. The human body itself became the next challenge. Our ancestors were remarkably adaptable, but they were still mammals. They lost heat quickly once their skin and clothing became soaked. Animal hides helped, but they were far from waterproof. Wet fur became heavy, cold, and uncomfortable. Sleeping in damp clothing could drain precious body heat hour after hour. Even during seasons we think of as warm today, nighttime temperatures often dropped far enough to become dangerous. Archaeologists studying prehistoric campsites have discovered evidence that many groups deliberately chose locations protected from prevailing winds rather than simply choosing places with the best view. A rock overhang facing away from seasonal storms could remain surprisingly dry even during heavy rainfall. Finding shelter wasn't luck, it was knowledge accumulated over generations. Every valley had safe places, every mountain had dangerous ones, and someone in the group had to remember the difference. This is something we often forget about prehistoric people. They didn't survive because they were stronger. They survived because they remembered. Knowledge was their greatest tool. Long before maps existed, people carried entire landscapes inside their minds. They knew where fresh water appeared after storms. They knew which caves flooded every spring and which remained dry. They knew which trees attracted lightning and which cliffs sheltered nesting birds. That information wasn't written anywhere. It lived only in memory, and memory had to be protected as carefully as fire itself. The rain also transformed the forest into something unpredictable, small. Streams became rushing rivers. Loose stones rolled down hillsides. Thick mud swallowed footprints and made every step uncertain. A simple slip while carrying food or firewood could break an ankle. Today, That means calling for help. 40,000 years ago, it could mean never returning home. In prehistoric societies, injuries were often more dangerous than predators. A healthy hunter could travel for miles. An injured hunter slowed everyone. Every movement suddenly required more energy. More food, more protection. One accident could threaten an entire family. That's why experienced people often became even more cautious during storms. Patience wasn't weakness, it was survival. Rain also changed the behavior of animals in ways early humans learned to understand. Deer stopped feeding in open grasslands, small mammals disappeared beneath roots and rocks. Birdsong faded. Predators adjusted their routines too. Large cats often moved differently after prolonged rain, taking advantage of reduced visibility and softer ground to approach prey more quietly. Humans weren't the only creatures looking for shelter. Everyone was. Sometimes, that meant dangerous encounters. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, archaeologists have discovered caves that preserve evidence of repeated occupation by both humans and carnivores over thousands of years. Bears, hyenas, lions, and people often return to the very same shelters, just during different seasons, or sometimes much closer together than anyone would have preferred. Imagine reaching the only dry cave you've ever known after walking through cold rain all afternoon. The arch entrance looks empty, but fresh claw marks cover the stone beside it. Now you have a decision to risk entering or face the storm. Outside, neither option feels safe. Moments like these probably happened countless times. Throughout human history, most left no trace behind, except the lessons survivors passed to their children. Those lessons became traditions, traditions became culture, and culture quietly became one of humanity's greatest survival tools. But perhaps nothing inside the shelter mattered more than one glowing source of light: the fire. To us, fire is ordinary. We strike a lighter, press a button, or flip a switch. For ancient people, fire was almost alive. It demanded constant attention. Dry wood had to be collected before storms arrived. Damp branches were stacked carefully so they could dry beside existing flames. Larger logs weren't burned immediately, but rotated closer to the heat until they were ready. Every decision saved precious fuel. Some researchers believe certain prehistoric groups may have assigned individuals, particularly older adults or those recovering from injuries, the responsibility of watching the fire while stronger hunters searched for food. Even if that role changed between communities, the logic remains powerful. Someone always needed to stay alert. A neglected fire could shrink into glowing embers surprisingly quickly during wet weather, and replacing it wasn't guaranteed. Keeping fire alive wasn't simply about warmth. It dried clothing, cooked food, hardened wooden spear tips, produced light after sunset, kept many predators at a safer distance, allowed people to continue working long after darkness covered the landscape. Without it, an entire camp changed. Conversations ended earlier. Tools remained unfinished. Cold crept into every corner of the shelter. In many ways, the fire was the beating heart of the group. Everything revolved around it, and once the rain had trapped everyone beneath stone and timber for another Wangjiangui, something remarkable began to happen. The hunt had stopped, but human progress had not. But surviving a storm wasn't simply about waiting. Waiting suggests doing nothing. Ancient people almost never had that luxury. The moment the hunting stopped, another kind of work began. Look around. The inside of a prehistoric rock shelter, and at first it seems surprisingly ordinary. A fire crackles in the center. Animal hides hang near the warmer stone walls. Wooden spears lean against the cave entrance. Children stay close to the adults while rain echoes across the landscape outside. Yet if you stayed there for a single day, you would witness something extraordinary. Nobody was idle. One person carefully inspected a spear point that had cracked during the previous hunt. Another chipped away at a piece of flint with patient, rhythmic strikes. Nearby, someone scraped an animal hide, slowly removing every remaining piece of flesh before it spoiled. An elder quietly watched the younger members of the group, correcting a grip here, adjusting a movement there. Without realizing it, they were running one of humanity's very first classrooms. Archaeologists often find thousands of tiny stone flakes scattered across the floors of prehistoric shelters. To an untrained eye, they look like worthless fragments. But those fragments tell an incredible story. Each one marks a single strike, a single lesson, a single attempt to transform an ordinary stone into a tool capable of changing someone's future. Making a good stone blade wasn't easy. The angle had to be right. The force had to be controlled. One mistake could ruin hours of careful work. Modern experiments have shown that mastering stone knapping requires hundreds, sometimes thousands, of attempts before consistent results appear. It's a skill that rewards patience more than strength. Rain gave people something incredibly valuable: time to practice. Without the pressure of chasing game across open landscapes, experienced toolmakers could slow down. Children could watch every movement. Teenagers could imitate each strike. Mistakes became opportunities rather than disasters. Knowledge didn't survive because someone wrote it down. It survived because someone was willing to teach it. That transfer of knowledge may have been humanity's greatest invention. Not the spear, not fire, not the bow. Teaching. Every generation began life knowing almost nothing. Everything that followed depended on someone older sharing what they had learned. The rain created the perfect classroom. Outside, the storm continued to pound against stone. Inside, civilization quietly advanced, and tools weren't the only things improving. Clothing demanded constant attention. Animal hides naturally stiffen as they dry. If neglected, they become brittle, uncomfortable, and far less effective at protecting against cold weather. Prehistoric communities developed surprisingly sophisticated methods of scraping, stretching, softening, and smoking hides to make them last longer. Researchers studying microscopic wear on ancient bone tools have found evidence that many were used specifically for working leather and fur. These weren't random objects. They were specialized equipment. Imagine the patience required. Hours spent carefully pushing a bone scraper across damp hide, again and again, until something once rough enough to wound your hands became soft enough to wear through winter. Storms created the opportunity for work that demanded precision rather than speed. The same pattern appeared again and again across prehistoric life. Broken spear shafts were replaced. Stone axes were reshaped. Wooden handles were strengthened. Containers woven from reeds or bark were repaired before they failed completely. Nothing useful was thrown away simply because it was damaged. Resources were too valuable. Every object carried the memory of the effort required to create it. Waste was a luxury ancient people could not afford. Even children likely played an important role during these long days indoors. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have noticed something fascinating. Children rarely learn survival skills through formal instruction alone. Instead, they participate, they observe, they imitate. A young child might begin by carrying small sticks for the fire. Later, they learn to identify edible plants. Eventually, they shape their first simple stone tool or accompany older hunters on short journeys. Education wasn't separated from daily life. Daily life was education. Every rainy day became another chapter in that lifelong lesson. The fire at the center of the shelter made all of this possible. Its warmth dried soaked clothing hanging nearby. Its light extended productive hours long after sunset. Its smoke helped preserve certain foods while discouraging insects from lingering too close. Some researchers even suggest that smoke inside caves may have reduced mosquito activity, making enclosed shelters far more comfortable during wetter seasons. A single controlled fire solved dozens of problems at once. No wonder it occupied the center of nearly every prehistoric camp. Yet perhaps the most important thing happening around those flames couldn't be measured by archaeology alone. Conversation. Think about what happens when people are forced together without distractions. Eventually, someone begins talking. Maybe an elder describes a hunt from many winters ago. Maybe another remembers where fresh water remained during the last great drought. Perhaps someone imitates the call of an animal, making the children laugh before explaining how hunters recognize it in the wild. Stories entertain, but they also teach. Long before books existed, stories carried maps, warnings, recipes, weather, patterns, family history, moral lessons, and survival strategies. A single tale told often enough could preserve knowledge for generations. Modern science supports this idea. Psychologists have repeatedly found that humans remember information far better when it is wrapped inside a narrative, rather than presented as isolated facts. Our ancestors didn't understand neuroscience, but they understood people. If you wanted someone to remember an important lesson years later, you turned it into a story. Perhaps that is why storytelling appears to be nearly universal across every known human culture. Because people enjoyed fantasy. Because stories helped people stay alive. Outside, the rain still fell. But inside the shelter, something invisible was taking shape. Not a weapon, not a tool, a shared identity. Each conversation strengthened trust. Each lesson connected generations. Each successful repair made tomorrow slightly less dangerous than yesterday. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the storm was accomplishing something remarkable. It had transformed a group of individual survivors into a community, and when the clouds finally broke apart, the landscape beyond the cave would look completely different. Fresh streams would cut through the valleys. New animal tracks would cover the softened earth, plants hidden beneath dry soil. Only days earlier would begin, pushing toward the sunlight. To many animals, the storm marked an ending. For ancient people, it often marked the beginning of an entirely new opportunity. And that is where our story turns next. Because once the rain finally stopped, the world outside didn't return to normal. It became something far more valuable. Eventually, the sound changed. For days, the rain had dominated everything. It drummed against stone, splashed through the forest canopy, and echoed across valleys like a constant reminder that the world belonged to nature, not to humans. Then one morning, it softened. The heavy pounding became a light tapping. The tapping became silence. For the first time in days, people stepped outside their shelter and looked at a completely different world. The transformation was immediate. The air smelled cleaner. Dust was gone. Leaves glistened under sunlight. Small streams appeared where dry ground had existed only days before. To modern eyes, it might have looked beautiful. To ancient people, it looked useful. Because this was the moment all there. Preparation began to matter. The hunters didn't rush blindly into the wilderness. They knew something most people today never think about: rain leaves behind information, and information meant survival. Every animal that had moved during the storm had unknowingly written a story onto the landscape. Soft mud became a natural record book. Fresh tracks covered riverbanks, valleys, and forest paths. Deer, wild horses, boar, rabbits, predators, everything that walked during the storm left evidence behind. Tracking conditions. After rain could be extraordinary, a skilled tracker could estimate an animal's size, direction, speed, and sometimes even its condition, simply by examining footprints in wet soil. Deep print suggested weight, a scattered trail. suggested panic. Fresh edges meant the track was recent, blurred edges meant time had passed. The ground itself was speaking, and ancient humans learned how to listen. Anthropologists have compared expert trackers to detectives. They notice details most people never see. A bent blade of grass, a broken twig, a patch of disturbed mud. What appears invisible to one person becomes obvious to another. This ability likely gave our ancestors an enormous advantage. The storm that seemed to stop hunting had actually prepared the perfect hunting conditions. Nature had revealed its secrets. All humans had to do was read them. But tracking wasn't the only opportunity rain created. Food itself began appearing in places that had been empty just days earlier. Across many regions of the world, rainfall triggers sudden biological explosions. Mushrooms emerge from hidden networks. Beneath the soil, edible plants produce fresh growth. Insects swarm. Small animals leave their shelters to feed. The entire ecosystem becomes more active. For prehistoric communities, understanding these changes could mean the difference between abundance and hunger. Knowledge mattered more than strength. The group that understood seasonal patterns gained access to food sources others might overlook. Imagine walking through a forest after several days of rain. To most people, it would look like a collection of trees. To a knowledgeable forager, it looked like a map. Every plant told a story. Every patch of soil offered clues. Certain roots became easier to dig because wet ground loosened around them. Nut-bearing trees dropped hidden food from their branches. Fresh water collected in rock basins and natural depressions. Resources appeared everywhere. For those who knew where to look, this is one of the biggest misconceptions people have about prehistoric life. They imagine constant struggle, constant desperation, constant suffering. Reality was often more complicated. Ancient people weren't simply reacting to nature. They were studying it, learning from it, adapting to it, generation after generation. In many ways, they were among the most skilled environmental observers who ever lived. And every storm provided another lesson. The children who had spent days listening to stories beside the fire now accompanied adults into the transformed landscape. This was where knowledge became experience. A lesson told inside a cave became unforgettable when seen with your own eyes. The muddy track discussed during the storm now stretched across the ground in front of you. The edible plant mentioned in a story now grew beside a stream. The hunting route described by an elder suddenly made perfect sense. Learning wasn't finished when the rain ended. It was just beginning. And as groups moved through this renewed landscape, they carried more than tools and supplies. They carried ideas. The spear repaired during the storm would now be tested. The rope woven beside the fire would now support shelters or traps. The hide softened through hours of careful work would now protect someone from cold winds. Every hour spent indoors produced something valuable outdoors. Preparation became advantage. Advantage became survival. This cycle repeated itself for thousands upon thousands of years. Then, something remarkable happened. Those same periods of forced shelter that encouraged tool-making and storytelling may have also encouraged a different kind of thinking, the kind that changed humanity forever. Because once immediate survival needs were met, the human mind gained something rare. Time to wonder, why do storms come? Why do seasons change? Why do animals migrate? Why does lightning strike? Why does the sun disappear behind clouds for days at a time? Today, science answers many of those questions. Ancient people had something else, imagination. And imagination is powerful. Every culture on Earth eventually developed stories about weather, rain gods, storm spirits, sky beings, sacred rivers, thunder myths, creation stories. Different cultures produced different explanations. But the pattern appears again and again throughout history. Humans wanted to understand the forces shaping their lives. Rain wasn't just water falling from the sky, it was mystery, it was power, it was something capable of changing entire communities. The earliest versions of those explanations were likely shared exactly where people gathered during storms. Around the fire, inside shelters, among family and friends, a child asks a question, an elder answers, the answer becomes a story, the story becomes tradition. The tradition survives for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. Long before books preserved knowledge, human memory did. And memory became one of the most powerful technologies our species ever developed. In fact, some of the oldest surviving oral traditions in human history appear to preserve memories of real environmental events that occurred thousands of years ago. That is astonishing. Imagine remembering something so important that your descendants continue repeating it for hundreds of generations. That kind of cultural memory doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people repeatedly gather, share, teach, and listen. Storms created opportunities for exactly that. What looked like inactivity from the outside often became humanity's most productive time. A hunter unable to hunt improved his tools. A child unable to explore learned valuable lessons. An elder unable to travel shared decades of experience. A community unable to move strengthened its connections. The rain delayed action, but it accelerated preparation. And perhaps that's the real story. When we imagine ancient people, we usually focus on dramatic moments: the hunt, the chase, the confrontation with predators, the struggle for survival. But those moments were only part of their lives. Much of human progress happened during quieter periods, around fires, inside shelters, during storms, during the hours when people stopped running and started thinking. The rope that secured a shelter, the story that preserved knowledge, the tool that improved a hunt, the lesson that saved a child years later. Many of history's most important developments were born during downtime, not during action. And maybe that's why rain mattered so much. It forced people to pause, to repair, to teach, to observe, to create, to imagine. When the storm finally ended, ancient humans didn't simply return to the same world they had left. They returned better prepared for it, better equipped, better informed, more connected, stronger as a group. The rain had never been wasted time. It had been investment. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson our ancestors can still teach us today. Because while the modern world treats waiting as a problem, ancient people understood something different. Sometimes the moments when progress seems to stop are actually the moments when the most important progress is happening. The storm passes, the clouds clear, the sun returns, and the people who use that time wisely step forward ready for whatever comes next. That was true 40,000 years ago, and in many ways, it's still true today.